Hello, Norfolk County, and welcome to another exciting edition of Radio Free Norfolk. I'm Dustin Wakeford.
This is John Harris.
And today we have a very special guest here joining us. He is the brand new minted People's Party of Canada candidate for the great riding of Haldimand, Norfolk, Mr. Bob Forbes, visiting us all the way from Caledonia. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Hey, Dustin Gavin. Good to see you. John, good to see you guys again.
Well, thanks so much for stopping by. So you just got nominated recently?
Yes.
In the last couple weeks. So for our listeners out there, tell us what's with this new People's Party of Canada party. Tell us what it's all about. Tell us what they might not know about it. Tell us how you got attracted to it.
That's a great question to lead this conversation off, Dustin. Thanks for asking. Probably the easiest way to address that is, and of course, you've got a lot of questions in there. But the biggest one is, what is this party? Where did it come from? For those who don't know, the leader of this new political party, the People's Party of Canada, has only been around for a few months since basically last fall. And it's a party that was started by a member of parliament by the name of Maxime Bernier. Mm-hmm. He's been a member of parliament for several years in the Conservative government.
In Quebec, right?
Cabinet minister, yes. Well-known individual, always known for speaking his mind. Mm-hmm. And he actually ran in the leaders' contest to be the leader of the Conservatives in Canada. Okay. A couple of years ago, up against someone like the current Andrew Scheer, who won that election.
Right, and it was very close, if I remember.
It was very close, yes. And the Dragon's Den guy, Kevin O'Leary.
Kevin O'Leary, yes.
A lot of support for people like that. But I always liked Maxime Bernier in that he always seemed to be a person that spoke his mind, and I had followed him for quite a while as a very interesting individual. Now, when he lost that election and lost the leadership candidacy, mm-hmm. I was a little, on the one hand, disappointed that he seemed to pull an angry kid kind of a stunt and, picked up his toys and went home, left the party, walked away.
Okay.
Only to start his own party called the People's Party of Canada. Mm-hmm. And at first I thought, well, is this sour grapes? I don't know. It didn't sit with me that well to begin with. But over the next couple of weeks, I started to look deeper into his policies, into what he was doing, why he did what he did. And I began to think that this is a really interesting dude. I like what I hear from this guy. This person is finally someone in Ottawa who's speaking his mind, telling it like it is. Someone we really need. And I said, wow, I like this guy. And then it kind of fell on deaf ears for a while, but I never lost interest in him. And then all of a sudden, the resurgence grew and it grew and it grew. And then all of a sudden, I saw these things about People's Party of Canada looking for candidates to come forward. And they were having different meetings across the country. So I went to a political meeting for the very first meeting in my life. Went to the People's Party of Canada.
Really, first time in your life?
First, I'd never gone to a political meeting before. Never, ever, ever. Always voted, but I've never gone to one of these meetings. And so at this meeting, it was held at the Wayne Gretzky Sportsplex up in Brantford. Okay. It wasn't even in our Haldimand Norfolk riding. There was a few ridings getting together at the same day. And during the meeting, there was an individual who was representing the party, who was speaking. And we had some general discussions about what was going on, so on and so forth. And I kind of liked what I heard. And of course, I asked a series of questions. I made a number of comments and spoke my mind at this meeting. And partway through the meeting, there was an individual there who said, Bob, we think you should run for the party in this riding.
Really?
And I was just flabbergasted. I rarely have no words to say, so I didn't say
That'd be
too
very
much.
overwhelming to be at your very first meeting and someone approaching you to ask you to run.
Well, it's because, I do ask some tough questions from time to time.
Yeah.
And it was, on the one hand, a little unsettling to have someone toss that my way.
Right.
But I kind of sat back and thought about it for a bit and said, well, maybe there's something that people see that I haven't yet kind of observed yet. And there was something there. So I hummed and hawed on it for quite a while. Didn't do much about it. But I went to a few more meetings. And then finally, I decided to put my name forward to stand as a candidate for this party. So that's kind of like how I get into it. But deep down, I like the party because of the policies that it has. The platform is pretty straightforward.
Right.
There's issues on equalization payments, trying to straighten out problems in our country. Some problems get more, some get less. There's problems with transfer payments. There's problems with, and I know it's a tough area down here called supply management, for example.
Right.
Legal gun ownership issues. There's problems with pipelines and energy. And the platform that this party is moving forward with is pretty straightforward, and it looks to me to be in the best interest of this country.
Right.
And I sometimes wonder, for the last several years, and it's become much more cemented in reality now, that I often can't tell the difference between the Liberals and Conservatives sometimes these days.
Well, that has been a criticism I've heard in the press a lot, that
Yeah.
they're just getting interchangeable almost in some of their policies. They would disagree probably with each
of
other,
course
but
they would.
yeah, no, but it seems that way.
But if you take a look at the Conservative policy on immigration, kind of like Liberals, you take a look at equalization, kind of like the Liberals, they're very similar. And in fact, probably the biggest thing that I really get miffed over is when I see some of this stuff on CPAC or whatever, or Parliamentary Channel or whatever.
Right.
You know, one of the leaders or somebody gives a response to something, and these politicians stand up like trained seals and start clapping. It's like, really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is just a problem here.
It does seem that backbenchers today don't have a lot of freedom to express opposition to policies that they're,
And that's the nice thing, if I may, about this People's Party of Canada. Right. They have been very open and receptive to really listening to the people.
Right.
This party represents the people of Canada. This party represents real Canadians, no longer interested in the special interest groups or the lobby groups. For heaven's sakes, here I am, Bobby Forbes, grew up in St. John, New Brunswick, went to school in Halifax, and here I am in a riding in Haldimand, Norfolk counties, beautiful part of Canada.
Yes.
And I'm excited about this because I think it's time that we do something differently. We've had the same old for 100 years. The Liberals and Conservatives have been running this country for the better part of the century.
Right, and I was just going to say, do you think that the fact that the Liberals and Conservatives are seen as almost interchangeable is why there's so much apathy right now? Because people just don't see a difference?
People are just fed up.
Yeah.
In the last several months with me out talking to people in my area in Caledonia or Dunnville or Delhi or here in Simcoe or different areas in between, I hear a lot of issues where they say they don't recognize a big difference, and they're looking for a change. We need a fresh approach.
Right.
We've been doing the same thing for years, and look at the mess we're in.
Right.
We need something different.
Do you? I have to confess, I didn't follow the Conservative leadership race as closely as maybe some people, but as you mentioned earlier, Scheer beat Bernier by a pretty close margin. Do you think that? I mean, I remember at the time that some of Bernier's policies, which seemed to be the same things he's fighting for now, one of the reasons why he didn't win the leadership was because it just seemed like, I think maybe the Conservatives, I don't know how to put this, but maybe they were playing it cautious. They just thought that, that it's like you said, maybe the Liberals and Conservatives are just playing it safe sometimes, and they're just, and Bernier seemed like he was really speaking his mind,
For as long as I've known him, again, just strictly through the political sphere,
Right.
I've always sensed that he is one of the few people in Ottawa that truly speaks his mind. And I think he has a strong moral code that I don't often see in a lot of others.
Right.
And that's probably the most important reason that attracted me to this group, because I've always been a believer in the following quote: stand up for what you believe in, because you can fall for anything.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
And I believe in this party. I believe in what's going on right now. I like what I see.
Right.
And I'm working hard to make sure that change is sweeping across the country. And I'm working hard at my riding right now in Haldimand, Norfolk, to see that change takes place.
Well, that's great. One of the things I did remember about that leadership race, and it really impressed me, was the courage he showed in that standing up to, as you said, supply management. And he's from a province where, they have a pretty big dairy industry. So for him to stand up to, people, that shows a lot of guts, I think.
Yeah, it's a real tough issue. And here we are in this area of Ontario where there's lots of farms as well. It's a tough issue. But I think deep down, Dustin, when you take a look at the numbers, there's approximately 10% of the farmers in Canada are engaged in some form of this cartel-like infrastructure, whether it's dairy, chicken, eggs, whatever.
Right.
About 10% of farmers, which means 90% are not in this sort of controlled environment where the cartel sets the prices, so on and so forth. And what that does is it helps support, to a good sense, those small amount of numbers of farmers who are in that business, but it also helps drive up the cost. Unfortunately for the rest of the consumers, all the consumers in the country who pay money for, cheese, dairy, eggs, chicken, whatever. We end up spending a lot more money because of this so-called control pricing through the cartel-based supply management chain that we have. And it is a big area that costs, I think, several tens of billions of dollars of extra spend every year for Canadians because of this supply management system that we have.
Okay.
And one of the tenets or the fundamental principles of the People's Party of Canada is they want to abolish this. But they cannot do it overnight. It has to take time.
Right.
And by doing so, it will help drive down the cost of these goods. It'll put more money back into the pockets of the regular Canadians, the hardworking Canadians. And maybe it'll allow some of these poor people or poor Canadians, for example, who are really struggling to make ends meet, they can buy the new coat for the kids. As kids growing up, they go through their growth spurts and they need a few extra dollars to buy these things. So we believe that the elimination of this supply management will certainly help the vast majority of Canadians. They will be paying less for these needed goods, but it will also offer an opportunity for these farmers, for example, to expand their markets into areas that we couldn't do now because we're controlled through this supply management agreement. But there will be foreign stuff coming in, but it will also allow our farmers to compete outside of our country. We'll get new markets out of it as well. But the nice thing about it is, even though the policy from the parties looking to eliminate this, there is some significant attention being paid to making sure that there are periods of transition to help support those farmers who will be directly impacted by that through various mechanisms.
Well, and let's face it, Holden and Norfolk is a hugely agricultural riding. So, that's going to be a big issue in the election, I think.
Well, yeah, there's lots of soy. There's lots of corn.
Yep.
There's some cattle and some other farming as well. There are some dairy down here as well.
Right.
But we have a big agriculture base down here. But overall, broadly based, it's about 10% of the farmers across the country are involved in this sort of a cartel-based system.
What are some of your favorite issues, things you most want to work on if you get there?
First and foremost, there are things that the party is looking at with respect to gun control.
Okay.
Immigration is another one that I'm pretty passionate about. I tell people I'm the eldest son of a tough, stubborn, Catholic, Irish, immigrant police officer. And so as a kid growing up, you kind of learn a few things in life. But my old man came from Ireland in the early 1950s. And if it wasn't for immigration, I wouldn't be here. But I think immigration is an important thing, or an important aspect.
Well, legal immigration is absolutely essential to the country.
We absolutely need legal immigration. Yeah. In fact, our federal government responsible for immigration, they have some truly dedicated employees working diligently, working hard to make sure that we have great services, great programming involved to get people in here who we need. In fact, we have a fabulous point-based system that brings people into Canada based on age, occupation, education, financial resources. And we need people to come in who meet certain criteria. But unfortunately, in the last several years, we see people jumping the queue.
Yes.
And
that's not fair.
Unless you've been living in a cave, you're missing this. But, when you take a look at places like, the Roxham Road in upstate New York, people coming across there by the thousands every month. And this is something which is costing the Canadian taxpayer dearly. And I think the numbers, if I have the numbers right, for each illegal immigrant coming in, and that's probably the wrong term to use, illegal immigrants. I think somebody in Ottawa now refers to them as the irregular border crossing. I think someone stayed up late one night to try to think of
created
that term.
Came out with that.
But whatever you want to call them, these people coming across, for whatever reason, irregular border crossers, that's costing the Canadian taxpayer, I think, $13,000 to $14,000 each. Oh. That's a lot of coin.
That is a lot of coin.
Now, some may stay, some may get deported, whatever the case is, but they all have an option and the right to an appeal or several appeals.
Right.
And by the time they exhaust their appeals and they get deported anyway, that cost now jumps to about $30,000 to $35,000 per person. And these are numbers presented by our parliamentary budget officers. I'm not making these numbers up.
No.
These are serious numbers. And now, last year alone, that cost Canadian taxpayers about $300 million. And I believe it's going to cost us this fiscal year, it's going to cost us about $400 million.
Wow.
Just to manage and deal with this irregular border crossing or illegal
And to put that in
immigration.
perspective, that would probably pay for a couple new hospitals.
At least.
Yeah.
So, can you just imagine what we could do with all that money? As you mentioned, new hospital, yes. Can we put it into social housing programs, better infrastructure, better transportation systems? Maybe even a cure for diabetes, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we could be doing with that money, but unfortunately, it's going here to an area that it shouldn't be going there. Most unfortunate.
Do you think that the People's Party and, I think there's other organizations have been unfairly, I guess what I'm saying is they've been unfairly labeled by the media and by certain political parties as being anti-immigrant, anti-immigration. Do you think that's unfair criticism?
Well, I think they just don't know.
Right.
And the reason is,
Just not informed.
the party's not anti-immigration at all.
No.
Absolutely not. Au contraire, mon ami.
Yeah, no,
It's
absolutely.
we need immigration. In fact, our birth rate here in Canada has been declining for several years, and I think it's about 1.4, 1.5, something like that now, very low. So for every couple, they have like 1.5 children. We need immigration in this country
Yes.
to help maintain the sense of social structure that we have.
Right.
Immigration is good for Canada, and Canada is good for the immigrants who possess the Canadian values we have. And it's everybody wins when the right type of immigrants get
Yeah.
in. Everybody wins.
Well, one of the criticisms I hear from a lot of people in all walks of life is they're saying, well, we always have these doctor shortages. Why aren't they allowing more doctors into the country? And I, quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that. But you're right. I mean, I think that Canada has an aging population, so we need immigration, or else we're going to have labor shortages. We're going to have all kinds of problems. So, what do you think? What is it about your background? I want to go back. You mentioned that your dad was a cop and an Irish immigrant. What do you think from your background helps you the most towards you being a good candidate and maybe hopefully one day a member of parliament?
Probably asking the tough questions, like why are things as they are, or why are things not as they should be? And I try to keep abreast of different things that are going on around the world. And I was recently heavily engaged in looking at this fabulous article. I think it's a great article. It's a magazine written by the Canadian Automobile Association.
Yeah.
CAA.
CAA.
Great organization.
Absolutely.
But what caught my eye in this article, I think this was the April edition or May edition, just recently off the press. And in this article, it talks about distracted driving and eyes on the road. Eyes on the road, for example. And the stats that they came up with were looking at about 43% of Ontario drivers admit to driving distracted.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Who is most likely to be distracted? Well, people who commute a lot, 90 minutes or more,
Yeah.
highway drivers, and younger people aged 25 to 34. So there's some interesting statistics in here. But what really caught my attention in looking at this article was that such a high percentage of people admit to using these hand-operated devices, in spite of the fact that here in Ontario, we've had some pretty tough distracted driving laws. They've been in effect for about a decade now.
Yeah, it's been quite a while.
And we still have a problem. And let me get a little deeper into what the problem is. According to a representative of the OPP, although I'm just focusing on Ontario for now,
Yeah.
but distracted driving, they say, played a direct role in roughly 50 of the province's 333 road collisions.
Wow.
That's terrible.
That is terrible.
Absolutely awful that these problems take place. And even though we have new fines for first offense of several hundreds of dollars and license revocation, whatever, this problem still exists. So I wonder, we have, like a big stick at hand. For example, you cross the line, you get whacked with a stick. We get a big fine, big ticket, take your car away, whatever the case is. But I wonder, is that really the best way to be motivating people to change the behaviors? Think back 30 years ago when you boarded an airplane. If you go down the aisle, you turn left, you can smoke. You turn right, you can't smoke.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
It's been a while, but yeah, I remember those
It
days.
would become socially unacceptable.
Yes.
You just don't do it.
You're right.
You don't do it. So why is it that we still haven't hit the critical mass yet where people are getting the message that it needs to be socially unacceptable to be driving distracted?
Yeah.
We have to fix that. So I wonder, should we be doing something differently? And although the Traffic Act, for example, is a provincial jurisdiction, transportation safety is a federal jurisdiction. And I wonder, are our federal politicians doing enough right now, leaning on, working with, encouraging the big organizations like the Facebooks or the Googles or the whatever? Are they working with them enough, or perhaps twisting their arms to a point to help encourage them to find a way to shut this distracted driving stuff down?
That's a really good point. Yeah.
For example, most of the current cell phones or the smartphones we have these days, there are switches that you can turn off. So if it senses that you're moving in a moving vehicle,
Right.
it will kind of shut the system down. But you have to turn it on to make it work, from what I understand. I just wonder, again, just wonder out loud, is it possible for these companies to develop some sort of an algorithm that says, if this vehicle is moving, that we know on a highway through Google Maps or whatever, if this vehicle is moving on a roadway and there's only one cell phone in that vehicle, and there's
Right.
probably algorithms that can figure out there's only one person in that vehicle
Right.
with a phone, and if the vehicle's moving, so it's probably the driver's. Let's find a way to shut it down so it doesn't work. I don't know, maybe there's things that we can be doing from a national perspective.
I don't know. John, you're the IT guy. What do you think about that?
Oh, sure. Bring me into it. My assumption would be yes, but the one thing I guess I would question you on is that from a privacy perspective. So I grew up kind of in the old school line, right, where the privacy in the United States actually meant something. We move into this modern age, and then all of a sudden privacy doesn't. So then all of a sudden, one implication I can see, and I don't know, what are the implications on privacy? Because then you're going to have this notion where the age-old question is, do the large tech companies have too much power, right? So do you really want the Facebooks knowing that much about you? Like right now, Bob's driving.
Yeah.
So
I that's a great point. I've kind of wrestled with this also, but I sometimes think that the greater good is more important than the individual. I sometimes think it's really important. Take, for example, when you go down here to Pearson International Airport, or any airport across Canada for that matter, there are signs, I believe, at every inspection agency going in for Canada Airport Transportation Safety guys, that you can choose not to have your bags or personal searched if you elect not to board the plane. It really is that simple. So the greater good now trumps your rights. So I think we have to look at things a little differently. We're in a new era right now. 20 years ago, we didn't have these smartphones or digital technology that we have today, or using it as much as we are now. But I think something has to be done, because when I take a look at these numbers, where there are several deaths across our province's highways, and when you take a look at one in particular, I think I mentioned it earlier, of the roughly, in 2018, Sergeant Kerry Smith of the OPP estimated that distracted driving was also a factor in the majority of the 70,000 collisions the force investigated last year. 70,000. That's just OPP. Now, we're not even talking about, Toronto Police Services, London, Windsor, Ottawa, Sudbury, Niagara region. We're not even talking about any of those police services. So when you take a look at what these numbers tell us, and it's likely that those other areas have similar numbers, Houston, we have a problem.
Absolutely. And just to touch on your point, I would say, like drinking and driving, years ago, almost everybody did it. But what the government did was bring in the liquor companies, bring in the beer companies, encourage people not to drink and drive, to bring in tougher laws. And now it's become socially unacceptable. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it still causes a lot of accidents, but nothing near what it was a few years ago. So maybe that's an important point.
My girls, my daughters, one married with one grandson. My girls are 30 and 33. And it's, with them growing up, it was a different world for them than it was for me.
Right.
With them, there was always a DD at hand.
Right.
Always a DD.
Yeah.
Without it was never a question.
Yeah.
And we never had that worry, because we knew that they lived in a different world.
In a
than we
different
grew
world,
up
yeah.
in. But I still think, even though they got the DD message,
Right.
there's still a problem with distracted driving.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And we need to fix it. So perhaps perhaps, I wonder, are our federal politicians doing everything they need to be doing right now?
Right.
Are they asking the tough questions? Are they working with the right organizations to fix this problem?
Right.
And if not, I got to be asking, if not, why not?
Well, one of the things that I can clearly see as a problem here is that politicians, by and large, from what I have seen, don't understand technology at all. So I think there has to be a greater capacity for the politician to understand the implications. So yes, you have the statistics, right? But then there's the implication on what the technology company can then see and understand. I think that's the biggest part, though, is that I think you're right. Absolutely, something needs to be done. The part that I have always been frustrated with is that, so my career is in IT technology, right? So you come from a cyber technology, security perspective. Politicians clearly don't understand. I think that there has to be greater awareness about what the implications are, and the government has to be more effective in its communication. I think that you're right. If you look at the United States, if you look in Canada, you look at other jurisdictions across the world, a lot of the times politicians are coming in, they bring the statistic, but there's not an understanding of what the regulatory requirement is or what it would look like. And I think that's something that needs to really change, especially in this modern age, because technology is moving at such a breakneck pace that the implications are changing moment by moment.
You know, this brings me to it, makes me think of something else. A completely different topic, but the same type of an idea. I was reading this article a few months ago about healthcare in Denmark. So we're going from one side of the ocean to the other side. You okay if I digress for a moment? Okay.
Absolutely.
Denmark's not a big country. They have several million people over there, spread over not a big geography. But in Denmark, they had about several issues developing within their healthcare system. And so for a few years leading up to 2007, they made the decision to take a real close look at the delivery of healthcare and do something about it to make it better, because there were problems. There were inadequate services in some areas, better in others. Good stuff here, bad stuff there. Cost a lot of money there, less money here. And so what they did, they basically blew up their hospital system. And I don't say that in a literal way, but they completely transitioned from what they were doing to something new. And over a short period of time, they went from about 45 major hospitals down to about 20 something. They cut their level of hospitals in half, and they collapsed several hundreds of communities and administrative units into fewer units. And so what they basically did was provided regional centers of expertise across the country to do certain things. And what happened over the next 10 years was quite remarkable. So in 2017, that was 10 years after the implementation of this policy, where they completely revamped how they delivered healthcare services, the country of Denmark found the following. Their review showed that in that 10-year period, services actually increased and costs actually decreased by about 2% a year. So they saved a lot of money and delivered better quality of service. Now, what I'm getting at is, I'm not saying we need to do that here, not at all. But what I'm saying is, here's a country that did something completely different. They trashed the way they were doing things for something better. And look what's happened. They've made a good success out of it. So I think as a country, we're a big country, 37 million people, give or take, a lot of area, big geography. We need to be looking at things differently. We can't be just looking at ourselves all the time. We have to take a look at what's working well for others outside of our own borders and perhaps explore how can we make things better for us. And those are the tough questions we need to be asking. These are the tough questions that our politicians need to look at. So I get your privacy thing, I get it. But sometimes you have to look at the greater good and say, perhaps there is a better way to do it. Just perhaps.
Okay, so let me ask you this. How do you see this election coming up in the fall unfolding?
Great question. I wish I was a Kreskin or a Houdini. Yeah.
Well, because you're newly nominated. Diane Finley's running for re-election. I think she's been renominated. The Liberals haven't picked anybody, or the other parties, so
Correct.
You don't really know who you're going to be running against yet.
But on the one hand, I care who I'm running against, but then again, I don't care who I'm running against. Competition has never bothered me in the past because I'm very passionate about what I'm doing. I look at the problem we have right now, and I'm ready, willing, and able to face those problems head on, dead on, and work hard to fix them. So how I see it unfolding, I have my optimistic wish list of what I could like to see occur. And they're obviously dealing with some tough competition. From what I've seen and heard of Diane Finley, she's a well-known commodity in the area. I do know she likes to show up at parades and wave hands and shake hands and stuff like that going down Main Street.
Yeah.
No, good for her.
Yeah.
But I can come back and we've been facing some very serious issues from a government perspective for several years now.
Right.
And we can talk about this more later on. But I sometimes wonder what she's been doing for the last several years. Mind you, she's been in the opposition side for the last couple of years, but for several years she was a member of parliament, cabinet minister, and there are some serious questions that I have to put to her, and maybe we'll get into those in a bit to say, really, what did she know, when did she know it, what was she doing about some of these big issues that we're facing?
Well, I was wondering, I think it would be fair to say that Haldimand-Norfolk is a fairly conservative riding. So do you think that makes this riding more receptive to the People's Party's message?
I'd like to think so, yes. And that's a great question because, as I mentioned earlier, I've always been conservative in nature.
Right.
A strong conservative. There are lots of beliefs I have with, spending frugally.
Yep.
Be very thrifty with what we spend. It's our money. It's my pocket. And I think we need to do things a little bit differently. So when I take a look at the competition, I have every expectation that this will be a tight race. This will be a hard fight. But being a conservative myself and taking a look at the platform that the People's Party represents and the strength that it brings to real Canadians, I think once the people of Haldimand-Norfolk get a look at our policies and start digging deep into it to say, you know what, I like these people. I think the people are telling me when I talk to them now, they're ready for a change. They're looking for a change because they don't like what they see.
So the hard questions. So I have sat on a stage with Diane Finley. We've crossed swords a couple of times. So you said later we could get to some of the hard questions. So what are some of the questions you want to pose to her?
Oh, well, let's talk about one of the biggest issues our healthcare system is facing right now is the opioid issue. This has been going on for decades, for several years. It's only recently caught the attention of, well, I shouldn't say only recently caught the attention of the federal government, but it seems to be only recently that our federal government is really doing anything about it. I sometimes wonder, though, whether what they're doing now is a little too late, or they're trying to close the barn door after the livestock has actually left the barn. For example, we continue to have a growing problem with opioids and opioid deaths in our country. Even right here in downtown Simcoe, there's an opioid issue. Brantford is tough. Oshawa is tough. There are other cities in the province. There are other areas of the country that have very serious issues with opioids. And the issue we're facing, some of it may have been initially developed by misadventure through overprescribing. Some would say yes. A lot would say no. A lot of people who were experiencing these untimely deaths with the opioid deaths, for example, did so through misadventure, and it was they were never legally prescribed an opioid in the first place. They obtained it through other illicit means. But however they got it, they're getting it, and we have a problem. Now, let's take a look at some of the policies that our governments have enacted in the past several years. Where this problem was developing 10, 20 years ago, it was escalating and it was seen, and that formed the development or spurred on the development of these guidelines. So these guidelines, for example, it's called the Canadian Guidelines for the Safe and Effective Use of Opioids. And in fact, back in April of 2010, a pretty substantive group of pain experts from across the country, in conjunction with the colleges of physicians and surgeons from every province and Nunavut and Yukon, so every federal medical regulatory body was involved in the development of these guidelines, and against some pretty key researchers as well, put together these guidelines to help physicians better understand opioids and how they should be used in their practices. And in 2010, these guidelines came out that talked about, how to decide to initiate opioid therapy, how to conduct a trial of opioid therapy with a patient, how to monitor long-term opioid therapy, treating specific populations, and managing opioid misuse and addiction in chronic non-cancer pain patients. So this document was, in effect, a blueprint, a guiding document to help physicians better understand how they should be using strong medication for a very bad illness or a bad problem with these patients.
Right.
And it's been well known that in the world of chronic pain, multimodal treatments work best for patients, whether it's physiotherapy, psychosocial modification, mindful meditation, whatever the case is. A lot of these different approaches really help the patients. But unfortunately, in most provinces, they don't cover all of these services. So what are physicians left to use? Prescription medications. So this document was actually a pretty good attempt to provide physicians with some guidance as to what they should be doing and how they should be using it. Well, something interesting happened about 2 years after this document was published. There were a lot of discussions across Canada, various centers of excellence, lots of continuing medical education events, lots of conferences. But about 2 years later, in September to November of 2011, this was a year and a half after those opioid guidelines were presented. A year and a half after that, an individual in Toronto, a physician by the name of Dr. Erica Weinberg, did a research study. In fact, she asked a series of questions to a lot of physicians across this country. And of the questions she asked, there were actually 758 physicians who responded to these questions. So 758 physicians, that's a pretty good N value. And these physicians were from, Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Calgary, London, Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax, and St. John's. So again, a good cross-section of physicians from across this country. And of the 758 physicians who responded to these questions, here's one question. Are you aware of the Canadian guidelines for safe and effective use of opioids for the chronic non-cancer pain? And of those 758, 53% said yes, which meant 47% had no idea what they were talking about.
Wow.
That's pretty sad.
Yeah.
Another question. Inside this opioid manager, inside the guidelines, was something called an opioid manager. And inside that manager was a lot of tools that physicians could use to help them better manage their patients. And there were a lot of different documentations, assessment tools, so on and so forth. And another question she asked was, do you use the opioid manager in your daily practice? There were 726 physicians who responded to this question.
It's going to be well over 80%, isn't it?
Well, it was actually a whopping 14% said that they did, which meant that an astounding 86% said they did not. Houston, we've got a problem.
Wow.
There's something wrong.
Yeah.
So in light of this, I got to wonder, what were our politicians doing? When all of this was developing a decade ago, what were these people thinking? Mm-hmm. Were they doing anything? And if not, why not? Those are the tough questions the voters have to be asking our politicians who are the incumbent ones these days. What were you doing? What did you know? And when did you know it? And what did you do? And if nothing, why not? Because people are dying and nothing was being done for such a long time. Now, let's fast forward a couple of years later. And here we have, in the year 2017, a new set of guidelines, the updated guidelines that were published in, I want to say, the spring of 2017. And one of the key authors behind it is Dr. Jason Bosey from McMaster University in Hamilton. And again, it's a great set of guidelines that talk about how physicians should look at using these types of strong medications in their practice for patients who need pain relief. It's a great document, but I got to wonder if the uptake of this updated one at 2017 is like the other one, we have a problem. So I've actually reached out to a couple of people at McMaster and I've asked them if there's something new within the last several months that was a similar review to what Dr. Erica Weinberg did on the 2010 guidelines. And I'm still waiting to hear back from McMaster on that. And hopefully they'll get back to me to say either yes, we have something, and yes, we know they're used far more often than the older ones were. But the troubling thing is, in spite of all of this, we still have problems. Now let me take you back to the introduction of a excuse me, a technology called the tamper-resistant formulation for these products. It's been well understood that opioids can cause a problem. And the more you use, the more tolerance will develop generally. The more tolerance develops means you need a higher dose, or you escalate the dose to get the same effect that you did before. That in no way means someone's they're addicted to it. It just means that their receptors have been affected to a degree that you need more to make it work. Not a big deal. It happens all the time. And under the right circumstances, with the right management, the right oversight, the right assessments, they're good drugs to use for these patients. However, sometimes things go wrong and we have problems. But with the guidelines being used, followed, implemented, they were structured in such a way to help prevent the development of these problems. Now, as these problems of deaths and misadventure were escalating a decade ago, our federal regulators decided to say to the manufacturers of these long-acting opioids, they said, you know what? You have these long-acting opioids in Canada for sale. We want you to come to market with these tamper-resistant formulations. And a lot of them were doing this on their own anyway. But they mandated that the manufacturers produce these drugs in the packaging called the TRF, or tamper-resistant formulation, but only for the long-acting opioids. Now, in the world of medical science, it's always been well understood and accepted that if you use a short-acting drug, you have to use it more often. So the more often you use these drugs, the more likely you are to have the development of this tolerance and dose escalation. Right. So that's why it's important to move to a long-acting drug as soon as possible in most therapeutic areas. But the problem was, in its infinite wisdom, our federal regulators mandated that only the long-acting opioids be packaged up in a tamper-resistant packaging back 5, 6, 7 years ago, when they first started to introduce this legislation or these requirements. So the question was, why did they only make this mandatory for the long-acting opioids and not the short-acting ones? That's a problem. Because when people who are interested in abuse and diversion were recognizing that now these longer ones were coming out in the tamper-resistant packaging, making them more difficult to get, they just switched over to short-acting ones. So the short-acting ones began to get used a lot more, and sales escalated exponentially. So I wonder if the policies that were implemented by our federal government in the recent decade were such that they mandated only one type of a drug be produced in this tamper-resistant formulation, did their policy to do this actually assist in the escalation of the problem we now see? Were they somewhat culpable in driving an increase in the opioid-related deaths that we have today? I don't know the answer to that, right, but that's a question we need to ask. And so I wonder, why were these policies made back then? Who knew about them? Why were they done? Because in my mind, in my opinion, it should have been an all or nothing. Why were they not done for the short-acting opioids?
What kind of changes would you like to see? So if you had the ability to start to bring in changes, given your background, what are some of the changes you'd like to see?
Not only do you have to listen to all the experts, you have to use some common sense as well. And when I say common sense, I'm reminded of something that was just recently published by, I want to call him David Thormockton, a really interesting healthcare professional from the States. And in the US, they had developed a series of guidelines as well, much like we did in Canada. And the FDA, for example, came out with a series of policies around how to use these sorts of opioids. And they put restrictions on the dose, on the numbers of pills that could be prescribed, how long they could be prescribed for. And these were guidelines, much like the Canadian guidelines. But what we found here in Canada was much like what they found in the US, was these guidelines were suddenly being interpreted as policy, as rules, as regulations. And so insurance companies began to suddenly limit the amount of coverage that they would afford patients for these types of medications. And all of a sudden, patients who were on stable doses for long periods of time were suddenly getting cut off. Or their physicians were saying, I can no longer prescribe these types of drugs because it's against the rules, or the college won't let me prescribe them. So these guidelines which were coming into play were now being looked at as policy or procedure or rules. Patients were left hung out to dry, and there are several reports of some of these patients turning to street drugs to satisfy their cravings and needs for self-medicating. And some of these patients inadvertently met their untimely death by suicide. Most unfortunate. So there was a lot of collateral damage that took place. And I want to say just within the last month or two, I can't quite get my fingers on it, but I think the name was David Thormockton or something like that, wrote a review just recently within the last month or two about how those guidelines have been misinterpreted by society, and they actually did cause a lot of collateral damage, and they really should be used accordingly. And as such, patients have been hurt by these guidelines being misinterpreted as policy. And physicians need to do a better job at addressing the problems that they're being faced with their patients. You know, I've been into different offices, and you sometimes see the signs up there that it says, no, this office does not prescribe opioids, for example. That might be fine and dandy for whatever reason. But can you imagine in today's day that if you walked into a physician's office and you saw a sign that said, this office does not prescribe insulin? What kind of a backlash would we have on that one? So here we have like a useful tool that when used accordingly and appropriately could help get people back into their daily functions in a positive manner. But unfortunately, the way things have turned out, rules and regulations have turned up as they are, and we now have serious issues. And of course, there are people who are saying blaming the drug companies, when in fact, when I look at these things, maybe it was our own federal regulator policies that have helped contribute to this as well. You know, let me take this a step farther. Over the last couple of years, our federal government has done a lot to help mitigate against these problems. In fact, they've created funding for a number of different areas, such as to increase access to treatment, increase access to harm reduction, working to fix the tainted drug supply, because a lot of this supply is, you know, you've heard of the drug fentanyl. A lot of these fake opioid pills are coming in. They're you know, maybe crushed flour or something like that, mixed with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a very potent narcotic. So our federal government has been doing different things to try to help mitigate against that. But this is all now. What was being done a decade ago when this problem was first developing? And why did it take so long to fix this? There's a problem. In fact, when I take a look at something like one of our government agencies, and again, we know that our Canada Border Service Agency folks, you know, there's tens of thousands of employees working their butts off across the country to help keep us safe. And a couple of days ago, I was taking a look at the CBSA seizures for the fiscal year of 2017, 2018. So a couple of years ago, I was taking a look at the different types of seizures that they've picked up from people crossing our borders. Now, annually, CBSA, the Canada Border Service Agency, they process approximately 100 million travelers at over 1,200 entry points throughout Canada, as well as 39 international locations. So that's a lot of people, 100 million people coming through. And they also involved with Canada Postal Agency, you know, courier stuff coming in as well. But in the recent years, let me see, in 2017-18, CBSA, in their seizures for fentanyl, they confiscated 14,000 grams or 14 kilograms of fentanyl, 14 kilos of fentanyl. That's worth several thousands of dollars, but it can translate into literally millions of dollars when pumped out into tablets. So in 2018, they had seized about 14 kilos. The next year, the next fiscal year for 2018-19, they seized 5 kilograms. So I got to wonder, what happened? We've lost, for some reason, the seizure rate went way down. Now, maybe there's less coming in. I don't think that's the case. There's probably more getting in, they're just not getting it. So my question is, are our current federal leaders, are the politicians providing our CBSA agents and their organization with the financial resources and the tools that they need to stop this problem? I don't know that the answer is there yet. We know that they're doing some things right now, but I think there's a lot more that they should be doing. It's been well established that a lot of this fentanyl is coming in from China. They have plants over there manufacturing kilo after kilo after kilo and shipping it out. And they'll basically guarantee delivery to anywhere in the world. And if it doesn't get you, don't worry about it. We'll send you another one, no charge. So it's getting through. And that kilo of fentanyl can be pumped out into a lot of tablets, and that's what's killing our people these days. So the question is, have our politicians in the past decade been doing what they need to be doing to help keep our streets safe?
Well, let me ask you this, Bob, because, here in Simcoe, one of the big issues, especially here in the downtown area, is the methadone clinics. Now, methadone has been used for quite some time now to treat drug addiction, and now there's a new one, Suboxone, I believe it's called.
It's been out for several years.
Yeah. So tell me your thoughts about these methadone clinics.
Great, very needed, absolutely needed. They're helping to prevent ongoing addiction issues.
Right.
These people will be on methadone for life.
Yeah.
It's not a pleasant thing to do, but the alternative is you'll be a junkie or an addict for life. And people when they make the decision to get clean, applaud them. Congratulations. We need more people willing to step forward to find a fix to the problem, because for far too long, while this problem was developing and existing and growing and thriving,
right,
and getting deeper and deeper, more problematic, our government agencies were just sticking their head in the sand and really not paying attention to addiction services or
right,
mental health services.
Right.
We weren't taking care of the people who needed it the most.
Right. But surely, keeping somebody on methadone for their whole life, you really think that's the best way to treat it?
What's the alternative, Dustin?
Well, I don't know. I'm asking you. You seem to be you seem to be an expert on it. Is there not a way of...
I'm not an expert on it.
No, but I'm wondering, is there not a way of weaning these people off methadone eventually, or?
Well, there are some different drugs, this Suboxone now. They have the implantable ones that work for a long time, and I know it's my understanding that various provinces are now covering that,
right,
for their ODB patients here. They're the implantable device, and
right,
it works for several months at a time.
Right.
And so there are other options out there, but they cost money.
Right.
But then again, you got to look at the what's the risk benefit on this one. If you have somebody who's on, a junkie, a crackhead, or whatever the case is, out stealing, breaking into places, break and enter.
Yeah.
We have a lot of associated costs with that, whether it's law enforcement agencies getting involved, policing services, judicial system. Like you can't lock people up out of this. You have to fix the problem, and it's not locking people up. That's not the answer. We have to fix the underlying problem, and maybe it involves more people than just law enforcement, more people than just
absolutely
the medical establishment, more people than just the healthcare community.
Right.
Maybe churches, maybe schools, maybe social clubs, maybe families have to take a bigger role in this, because perhaps, again, just perhaps, when Johnny the addict has been stealing from home, maybe mom and dad didn't do as much as they probably should have to nip this in the bud and find help, or pressure their politicians, pressure their healthcare providers to find a fix. Maybe we as a society need to do more than we've been doing in the past. They've often been said, it takes a village to raise an idiot. and maybe
that's a good one. I
in
like
this particular issue,
we've
all contributed to the problem.
Yeah.
All of us haven't necessarily done as much as we probably should have to fix the issue. So those are the questions that I think we need to be asking our politicians. What have you been doing to fix the problem we're in? Because this has been going on for 10, 20 years and getting worse and worse and worse.
Right.
What have they been doing for so long? And right now I'm thinking, I don't know. More's happening now, getting a little bit better, but is it just a little bit too little too late?
Well,
doing lots, which is good,
right,
but so much more needs to be done.
Well, one of the criticisms I hear most of all here in town is that, a lot of clinics, I'm not just talking about here in Simcoe, but all over Ontario, that a lot of these clinics that are springing up seem to be geared towards just profit, to be actually making money off drug addiction. And I'm not saying there isn't some of them that do some good, but what's your take on that?
Justin, I couldn't comment on that. I'm sorry. Whether they are or not, that's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay, fair enough. And I appreciate you being honest about that. I wanted to go back. You were talking about fentanyl earlier, and I wanted to ask you, now you're saying that a lot of it's coming from China, and they're making, I guess a lot of our listeners would be confused as to why it's so prevalent now. We're hearing about all these overdoses, not only in Ontario, but all over the world. Okay, so why are they using fentanyl? Just because it's cheaper, or?
Well, it's a synthetic, so it can be manufactured through a chemical process. And these factories, primarily in China, are pumping it out by the kilos, kilo
Right.
after kilo after
Yeah.
kilo, shipping it worldwide.
But surely not with the
Pretty
intention of killing people, though. Is that? I mean,
Okay.
okay. Well, I don't know.
Well,
I did see. I did see there was an episode of 60 Minutes. I don't know, about a month or so ago, and it was saying there is a factory in China where they're making tons of fentanyl, and the owners know it's killing people, and they just simply don't care, and because they don't,
Yeah.
they figure there's.
And
well,
what is the Chinese government doing about it? We're trying to
not much.
Well, from a Canadian perspective, as we talked earlier, in the Canadian Border Service Agency, they're getting an increase in funding to help interdict or stop these importation of fentanyl coming in.
Yeah.
But as we see by their own numbers, by their own admission, there's not a lot of it being seized. So there's something going on. It's getting in somehow.
Right.
And so I wonder if our approach to increase methadone clinics, if our approach to increase border security, if our approach to improve technology to stop this stuff from getting in, improve law enforcement to allow law enforcement officers to better detect dangerous driving due to impaired substances or
Yes.
whatever. Maybe. Now I'm not a big fan of tariffs at the best of times.
All right.
But maybe, just maybe, we have to look at doing things a little differently. If China's not willing to do something to shut themselves down, to fix the problem, to stop it on the inside,
Yeah.
maybe there are other avenues that we could explore to help encourage them to take a more active role
Okay.
into exploring what they should be doing to shut that down and prevent that product from leaving their shores.
Well, that sounds like you're. What would you propose? What kind of solution? I'm interested to hear.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of tariffs at the best of times.
Okay.
However, sometimes I think there's an opportunity to encourage other jurisdictions to take a more active role. And perhaps there are some things we can be doing. Maybe to start increasing some importation duties on certain products that come from said parts of the world. Maybe so. Have we done that yet? I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
Again, I'm maybe not a big fan of it, but if we haven't tried it in the past and the problem continues to get worse, then maybe we need to try to look at another way to fix the problem. If you can't fix it on our end, maybe we should try to fix it on the other end.
Well, it's interesting you talk about tariffs and that because, in my generation, I've grown up in the world of free trade where tariffs were considered to be a bad thing. But over the last few years, we've started to see a resurgence of tariffs and that. And I from what I've seen, some of them seem to be beneficial, I think, for different countries and that. So I'm not sure now this new free trade agreement, well, some would say fair trade agreement that we just signed with Mexico and the United States, it's geared towards eliminating these tariffs. What's your take on that?
Again, as I've said twice now, I'm not a big fan of tariffs.
Yeah.
I think we need to try to find a way to negotiate our way through good settlements that benefit all parties involved.
Well, my friends, it looks like we're running out of time, but I'd like to thank our guest, again, Mr. Bob Forbes, who's the newly minted People's Party of Canada candidate for our great riding of Haldimand Norfolk. So, Bob, we really appreciate you stopping by, and we hope you come see us again.
I've had fun here tonight with both you guys. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these insights with you. And I would welcome the opportunity to meet with any of your listeners. If they want to get in touch with you through whatever mechanism, I'm always available. I'll be happy to have a chat with them. Maybe coffee in their home. They can get a
sounds
few
great.
of their neighbors and friends together, and we can have a conversation about what Bob Forbes is like, what Bob Forbes represents, and what they look forward to, what they can get from me as a member of Parliament representing Haldimand Norfolk in the coming years.
Well, that sounds just great, and thank you for offering that very much. All right, good night, my friends, and join us again soon. Bye-bye.